You would just hold me back. Italy is not for old men. Margaret said it with a smile that was too sharp to be mistaken for a joke. The dining room went silent, except for the sound of my fork dropping against the plate. For a moment, nobody knew what to do. A few awkward laughs rose from the far end of the table. My brother-in-law cleared his throat, and my daughter tried to busy herself with the breadbasket. But the words hung in the air, heavy and humiliating. I sat there, 62 years old, staring at my wife of nearly 40 years. Margaret was 58, still working at an insurance firm downtown. She had her glass of red wine raised like she was making a toast, as if embarrassing me in front of our family was some kind of celebration. Daniel, our oldest, 35 now, with a career in software that paid him more than I had ever earned. At the mill, smirked and shook his head. He looked straight at me, then back at his mother. She is right, Dad. Italy would be too much for you. Too much walking, too much noise, too many crowds. Better to stick to something closer to home. His words landed harder than hers. I could take Margaret's jabs. I had been taking them for years, but hearing my own son back her up cut deep. It was the look in his eyes that stung the most, like he saw me not as his father, but as a man already past his usefulness. Emily and my youngest, at 32, sat quietly near the end of the table. She pressed her lips together, her fork unmoving, her gaze fixed on the food in front of her. She did not join in, but she did not speak up either. I caught the way her hand tightened on the fork. That small gesture was the only sign that she had heard and understood. I forced a smile, the kind you put on when you are cornered and want to pretend you are not. The roast chicken on my plate lost all flavor. The mashed potatoes turned to paste in my mouth. Margaret went on, her voice filling the silence she had created. Italy is for people with energy. For the young. For people who want to live, not for someone who spends his days in the garage or watching television. I wanted to answer. To remind her that the house we were eating in had been paid for with the money I made during long nights at Harris Lumber. To remind Daniel that his tuition had come from my overtime hours and my back that ached every day. But the words froze before they reached my lips. So I chewed and nodded and let the laughter swell again as Margaret turned the conversation toward her office and a younger coworker named Alex who had run a marathon last year. She told the story like she was proud of him, like she wished she were sitting at his table instead of mine. The others leaned in, relieved that the sharp moment had passed, eager to laugh and forget. I kept my back straight, my hands steady on the table. I smiled when someone looked my way. Inside, I was collapsing. I had never felt so small, in a room filled with people who were supposed to be my family. The meal stretched on course after course. The smell of pie filled the room. Margaret's store-bought pecan pie that she claimed was better than anything homemade. Plates clattered, glasses refilled, stories told. My words were gone. I barely spoke again. Every sound seemed to come from far away, muffled by the echo of her voice. Italy is not for old men. When I could no longer bear the noise, I pushed my chair back and stood. Nobody stopped me. I told them I needed some air. Emily's eyes flicked toward me, but she said nothing. Daniel was laughing at something Margaret had said. I stepped outside onto the porch. The air was warm, the cicadas buzzing from the trees, the street quiet under the dim glow of the lamps. I leaned against the railing and gripped it until my knuckles whitened. Inside, through the window, I could still see them. Margaret laughing. Daniel nodding along the rest of the table, relaxed now that I was gone. I turned my head away. I thought of the years at the mill, the nights I came home too tired to eat, the weekends I spent repairing the house, the vacations I never took, so we could put money toward the kids' futures. I thought of the long days that turned into long years, and how quickly all of it had been dismissed with a single cruel sentence. The front door opened softly. Emily slipped out carrying a glass of water. She did not look at me at first. She set the glass on the railing beside me and stood quietly. For a moment we shared the silence, the chirping of cicadas filling the gap between us. She touched my arm lightly, then went back inside without a word. I stayed out there long after the house quieted, staring at the street, listening to the faint sound of laughter fading into memory. Margaret's words circled in my head over and over, each repetition carving a little deeper. Italy is not for old men. I breathed in the warm night air and let the anger settle. Something inside me shifted, something I had not felt in years. It was not loud or fiery, not yet. It was quiet, steady, a spark in the ashes. They thought I was finished. They thought I had no fight left in me. They were wrong. The morning after that dinner, I woke before the sun and walked the length of the house without turning on a light. For years, my mornings began with an alarm, a thermos of coffee, and the steady drive down South Congress toward Harris Lumber. 40 years of that rhythm had built the bones of my days. When I retired last spring, the rhythm stopped. I told myself I had earned the quiet. I told myself I would learn to like it. Margaret said little in those first weeks. She left for work at 8 sharp in a blazer, and Flat's hair pinned neatly, a stack of files tucked under her arm, like the city was waiting for her to arrive. She worked for a big insurance firm on West 6th, the kind with glass walls and a lobby that smelled like citrus. When I asked how her day went, she said fine, then added that I would not understand the pace. I tried not to take it as a slight. I cleaned up dinner and wiped the counters until they shone. I told her she did not have to worry about the lawn anymore. I thought doing more would ease whatever sat between us. On a Sunday afternoon in September, she stood in the doorway of the garage and watched me rebuild a drawer from an old maple dresser I had dragged off a neighbor's curb. Her arms were crossed, her expression distracted. I told her how the joints would fit tighter this time, and how the grain would really show once I sanded it down. Then she said she could not stay, because she and a few people from the office were heading to a wine tasting out by Dripping Springs. His name was Alex. I wiped my hands on a rag and told her to have fun. She gave a quick smile and left without asking if I wanted to come. She would come home and talk about how quickly Alex learned the new claims software, how he caught an error that saved a client a few $1,000s, how he remembered everyone's coffee order without writing it down. She said he reminded her that being decisive was a young person's habit. I nodded and told her that sounded nice. I did not say what I was thinking, that I had spent 4 decades making decisions when a miscut could cost a week's profit. Other comments came later and sharper. She said I was letting myself get soft. When I asked her what that meant, she laughed and said I would not get it. One evening, when I suggested we take a weekend drive down to the coast, she waved it off and said she did not have time to babysit me through crowds and traffic. Then she said, a line I will not forget. You are a man waiting to die in a comfortable chair. I kept moving because the alternative was to sit and let it crush my ribs. I took longer walks around the neighborhood. I fixed the broken step on the back porch. He chuckled and told me to enjoy the blessing. Margaret began staying out later. She said a client dinner had run long, or the traffic downtown was awful, or she had stopped by a coworker's birthday gathering. When she came home, the house brightened for a moment, then dimmed again when she shut herself in the bedroom with her laptop. I watched a high school football game on the living room TV with the volume low and the sound of her keys clicking behind the wall. One Friday in October, Emily called to ask if I could help her hang new curtains. I drove to her place and we drank coffee while her cat watched from the couch. She asked how Mom was doing and I told her Margaret was busy and doing well at work. Emily frowned at the way I said it, but she did not push. That night, I could not sleep. I lay awake listening to the house breathe and imagined the mill at dawn, the taste of sawdust, the sliding whine as a blade bit into oak. Around midnight, I gave up and went to the kitchen for water. I heard Margaret's voice. She was not talking aloud. It was that soft, urgent voice people use when they think they are being discreet. I paused in the shadows, the tile cool under my bare feet. Her laugh came first light and teasing, not a sound I had heard in our kitchen for a long time. I heard her say that the Florence photos looked unreal, that she could taste the wine just by looking, that she missed that feeling of being surrounded by people who understood momentum. Then I heard the name again. Alex. She asked him if he had booked the flights yet, or if he was still deciding between dates. She told him that late spring was the perfect time, that tourists were lighter, then that it would give them room to breathe. She said she was ready for something that did not feel small. The refrigerator hummed and the air conditioner clicked on. She told him she could make it work. She told him she would handle her end at the office. She told him not to worry about me. She said that with a small chuckle that tightened my throat. Then I heard the soft chime of an incoming message and a pause. She sighed in a way I knew meant she had just seen a photo. She said it looked perfect. She said she could not wait. I moved past the family photos that lined the wall. The one of Daniel in his graduation gown. The one of Emily holding a paper crown from a birthday cake. I reached our bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed without turning on a light. In the dark, I could hear the faint rhythm of her voice continue in the kitchen. The words were not clear anymore, only the cadence and easy intimacy that told me what my mind had not wanted to say aloud. I was not standing beside my wife in her world. I was a point of reference, a shape in the background, a man who had stepped off the moving walkway while she kept gliding forward. She had found someone to match her stride. She had decided I did not matter in the way I once had. I lay back and stared at the ceiling. The room smelled faintly of laundry soap and cedar from the closet where my old jackets hung. Footsteps crossed the hall. Margaret paused in the doorway, then moved on to the bathroom. Water ran. The medicine cabinet closed with a soft thud. A minute later, the bed shifted as she lay down on her side, her back to me. Her breathing evened out quickly. Mine did not. I watched the slow rise and fall of the shadow on the wall and let the night hold me still. I only knew the house would not sound the same again. Margaret came home early for once, the sky still pale over the live oaks, her laptop bag on one shoulder, and a restless energy in her step. She would be gone 2 weeks in May. Italy. The firm was sending a small team to Florence and Rome to meet partners, she said, and Alex would handle the logistics. Was Alex going too? She nodded as if it were obvious and said he had already begun blocking the calendar. I told her I wanted to come. I reminded her of the old evenings when we spread travel magazines across the coffee table and circled vineyards and bell towers. We had promised each other that one day we would go. She said I would embarrass her and that I should stay home. I asked if she really believed I would slow her down, if she truly thought I could not keep up. She made a small sound somewhere between a laugh and a sigh, and said travel at that pace required energy I did not have anymore. She said work trips were not vacations, and that she did not have time to shepherd me through crowds and late dinners. A long time ago, Italy had been a promise we made to keep the future bright, when the present was all work and bills. I remembered dog-eared pages for Tuscany, Rome, Venice. I remembered telling her about the sound of shoes on stone streets, the quiet of a church at noon, the taste of ripe tomatoes warmed by sun. She was taking that promise, carrying it across the ocean, with someone else, and she had told me to stay home. I set a plate of scrambled eggs on the table and poured her coffee the way I had on hundreds of sleepy workdays. I told her I could handle the trip. I said I was not asking for a tour, only a seat near hers on the plane, and a couple of quiet meals in a place we had once both wanted to see. She said it would be a hassle. She said it was a professional commitment, and not something to tack on a spouse for fun. She would bring back photos. I watched the corners of her mouth tilt upward as she typed. I stood in the doorway of the living room and looked at the bookshelf where an entire row of travel guides leaned together like a long-held breath. They had been purchased in the thin years when we chose hope on credit. I pulled the Florence book from the shelf and opened to a page I had once folded at the corner. The Ponte Vecchio at dusk. I closed the book and put it back. That afternoon, I went to the garage. I planed a warped edge until the shavings curled light as ribbon and dropped in a small pile that smelled like a younger version of me. I told myself to focus on the line, to follow the grain, to do the one thing I had always done when the world did not make sense. Work a surface until it became smooth. Then the pile of shavings grew and the truth remained. You will embarrass me. Stay home. I asked why she had not told me earlier, why she had waited until the plans were nearly fixed. She claimed she knew I would try to make it about me. She said this was her chance, her career, her life moving forward. She said she had no intention of being dragged down by a man who spent his afternoons counting screws in a coffee can. Her eyes met mine when she said it. They did not register regret. The emptiness there felt like standing in front of a window at night and seeing only your own dim shape reflected back. I realized that this was not the new emptiness from a single cruel week. It had been growing in quiet layers for years, like mineral deposits in a pipe you never think to open. Calendar invites stacked on the right. Rome partner meeting, Florence vendor dinner, train transfer between cities. Alex had accepted each one. I could read enough upside down to see the dates. 2 weeks in mid-May. I wanted to tell her that I had carried her bags through the worst of our years without ever asking for thanks. I wanted to say that if she had wanted to reclaim a dream, there were ways to do it together, even if we stumbled. Instead, I stood in the doorway and felt the life we had made tilt further toward a place where I did not exist. The next day, I asked Emily to meet me for coffee. We sat near the window of a small shop on South Lamar while the late morning traffic droned by. I told her her mother was traveling for work and that the trip was to Italy and that Alex would be there. Emily listened without interrupting. She asked if I was going with them. I told her I had been told to stay home. When she did speak, she said I should take care of myself and that I could come by for dinner any night I wanted. I thanked her. I did not tell her the rest of it, the part about the eyes that had gone flat. The days that followed felt hollowed out. Margaret packed later at night, trial stacking items in a small roller suitcase, weighing the difference between one pair of flats and another. She bought a new blazer and held it to her shoulders in the mirror. She said Alex thought the color photographed well. One evening I tried one more time. I suggested a short weekend before she left a small-town hill country trip with a single night at a bed and breakfast and a long walk under live oaks. Something simple to remind us who we had been. She shook her head and said there was too much to do. She asked if I had remembered to take the trash out to the curb. I said I would do it now. I carried the bin down the driveway and past the patch of lawn I had cut that morning. Later that night, the house was quiet. I stood in the hall beside the family photos. Margaret in her wedding dress, Daniel in his cap and gown, Emily with a paper crown from a birthday cake. My own face changed from frame to frame, the lines carving deeper with each year of the life I had chosen. I wanted to step into one of those photos and speak a warning to the younger man. Hold the dream in your own hands. Do not set it on a shelf and trust it to keep. When I returned to the kitchen, she was there again with the laptop open. The screen showed a simple confirmation in clean corporate font. Flights confirmed. Austin to Rome. Rome to Austin. 2 weeks. She closed the lid slowly and looked at me. For a second, I searched for anything I would recognize. There was nothing. The emptiness in her eyes felt like a door sealed from the inside. I nodded and turned off the light. In the quiet, I realized Italy had already done its work in our house. It had divided past from future with a clean line. On one side were the promises we had made. On the other was a woman planning a trip with another man and asking me to keep the lights on while she went. I walked down the hall and lay down on the bed. The night pressed close. I did not sleep. I stepped outside to cut the grass because motion felt easier than thinking. The mower rumbled across the Bermuda, and the lines I left behind were neat and straight, the kind of order I could still make with my hands. At the curb, the trash truck groaned to a stop. The driver lifted a hand the way working men do when words are extra. I lifted mine in return. By noon, I drove to the H-E-B on South Lamar for groceries we did not really need. A couple from down the block passed the end of the aisle and paused just long enough to register my face. I had not told a soul. I did not need to. News in a neighborhood travels on its own legs. He asked how retirement was treating me and asked after Margaret. I said she was traveling for work and that it would be busy. I could picture the shape of the talk already in motion. People do not mean harm most of the time. They want something to say, and they pass it along. When I pulled back into our driveway, Susan from next door was trimming the rosemary bush that spills over her front walk. She straightened when she saw me and crossed the stretch of grass between our houses without hesitation. She told me not to let Margaret make me small. The words hit me with a clarity I had not felt in days. She told me that when her husband was sick, people tried to assume the size of her life for her. She said she learned to push back by taking up space on purpose. Stand tall, she said, and do something with your hands every day that reminds you who you are. The afternoon stretched. I put away the groceries and fixed the sticky hinge on the laundry room door. I kept moving through small tasks because it kept me from hearing the silence that framed every room. Around 4, I took a slow walk to the mailbox. The heat shimmered off the street. At the corner, I passed 2 neighbors talking under the live oak. They stopped long enough to watch me approach, then started again a hair too quickly. Back inside, I washed my hands and caught my reflection in the microwave door. I went to the hallway mirror by the pictures and took a full look. I barely recognized him. It was a small change, but it mattered. Margaret came home after 6. I rinsed lettuce and sliced a tomato and put the pieces on a plate like a man serving a simple sentence. When she returned, she ate standing, scrolling with her thumb, then said she had calls. I carried my salad to the table and ate slowly. The house had the hush of a library where you do not belong. I took my plate to the sink, washed it, dried it, and put it away in its spot-second stack from the left. The order calmed me, but only briefly. Around 7:30, there was a soft knock. Susan stood on the porch with a Tupperware of lemon bars. She only wanted to make sure I was eating more than toast. Then she said the line again, gentle and firm. Do not let her make you small. I thanked her and watched her cross back through the twilight toward her yard, the rosemary brushing her calves. After she left, I went to the garage and clicked on the light. The smell of wood and oil steadied me the way a hymn steadies a church. I pulled the maple drawer front I had been shaping from the bench and ran my fingers along the edge. It needed a final pass with fine grit paper. I sanded until the surface felt like it would not hold a splinter under any circumstance. I brushed off the dust and propped the piece on a clean rag to take the finish. Simple work, clear result. The kind of exchange a person can trust. When I came back and the house was quiet again. Margaret was on a video call. I heard her voice through the door. She was discussing dates and schedules and someone named Stefano who would meet them at the station in Florence. She sounded alive. The tone she used with me had been replaced with a crisp, eager rhythm. I stood for a moment and listened to a life that had no room for mine. I walked to the bathroom and turned on the light. In the mirror that ran the length of the vanity, I took another look. The man staring back had the same lines and the same tired eyes, but there was something else now. Behind the fatigue, I saw a narrow edge of defiance. I thought about Susan's words and about the way pity had looked on faces at the store. I thought about the neighbors under the live oak and the pastor in the dairy aisle and the way the street felt when I carried the trash down to the curb. I was tired of being the story told softly at the corner. I shaved carefully and rinsed with cold water. I combed my hair back instead of letting it fall where it wanted. I put on a clean shirt even though there was no place to go. I went back to the hallway and looked again. The shadow had weight now. Not large, not loud, but present. I let the sight settle my breathing. Margaret ended her call and passed the bathroom on her way to the kitchen. She glanced in, paused half a second, as if trying to place what was different, then kept moving. I followed her to the doorway and asked if she needed anything for the trip. She said she had it handled. She asked if I could pick up her suit from the cleaners on Thursday. I said I would. The domestic choreography felt thin as paper. Later, I sat at the dining table with a pad of paper. I drew a line on the top sheet and then another. Nothing came to mind that made sense to write, so I just watched the lines and let my thoughts slow to their pace. Outside, the streetlights glowed. Somewhere down the block, a sprinkler ticked. The house did not feel like home, not tonight, but I was still in it. I placed the pad back on the table and turned off the lamp. In the dim, I passed the mirror one more time. The man in the glass looked back steadily. He was not large. He was not brave in any heroic sense. He was done making himself smaller to fit inside someone else's picture. The humiliation had done its work. The talk would keep moving through the neighborhood no matter what I did. But a small fire had started where the shame had been. It would need air and it would need time. I went to the bedroom and lay down on top of the covers, hands folded on my chest, and let the quiet stretch without fear. I wrote a single word that I could live with. Under it, I made 4 short marks and gave each one a name. The gray SUV had both our names because the bank wanted it that way. Joint title meant joint decisions, and joint decisions could be made by either party when matters turned urgent. Years of careful deposits and a few windfalls when the mill paid bonuses had swelled it to a number that felt unreal to the man I had once been. I reminded myself that Texas did not change the arithmetic of a joint account. I would take my share into a separate account with my name only. The house was harder to write without feeling the weight of it. 30 years of payments, repairs, storms, holidays, birthdays, all packed into wood and brick and a strip of grass I kept straight with a mower blade. I wrote deed, and then the word community, because that is what any Texas judge would call it. It meant the house was ours in a way that could be divided by law rather than by sentiment. Pension. Harris Lumber had a modest plan for men who stayed long enough and did not get themselves fired or injured. I had both avoided and endured enough to collect. Margaret also had a retirement account through the firm that she liked to mention when she talked about independence. I did not need to raid anything. I needed clarity. I wrote the letters QDRO because I had heard that word in a conversation years ago, and the sound of it had stuck a legal tool that lets a court divide retirement benefits without breaking them. I drew the last box and shaded it until the page darkened. I sat back and listened to the house breathe. The list looked plain and almost small on the paper, but each line felt like a handle I could grip. I flipped to a new page and wrote names. Under mine, I listed Credit Union Bank Branch on South Lamar Safe Deposit Key, 2 copies of the will, the password list in the back of the desk drawer. Under Margaret, I wrote the insurance firm, the HR manager she mentioned, sometimes the travel confirmations I had seen on her screen. I wrote Alex and drew a thin line from his name to the word Italy, and then to the word work, because people wrap personal choices in professional paper when they do not want to look at the truth. I let the line sit there without judgment. I opened the file cabinet and pulled folders onto the table. The night filled with the soft rasp of manila against wood. Vehicles, mortgage, taxes, retirement, insurance. I found the SUV registration and the copy of the title with both our names in block letters. I found the latest statement from the joint account and set it aside where my hand could reach it in the morning. I slid out the homeowner policy and the last 2 property tax receipts. I stacked each pile square and even then clipped them with binder clips because order steadies me. My phone lay face down on the counter. I picked it up, scrolled to the R section, and found a number I had not dialed in too many years. Robert had been a fast-talking kid in shop class who grew up and learned to speak slowly in court. We had rebuilt an engine together one summer in a garage that smelled like oil and burgers. He went east for law school and came back with a careful voice and a patience that I respected. I typed a short message that said I needed an appointment for a consultation. I did not dress it up. I hit send and placed the phone back on the counter like it was hot. I made coffee I did not need and poured it into a mug with a chipped rim. The first sip tasted like burnt toast, but the warmth worked its way into my hands. I went back to the pad and drew a narrow column to the right of the list. Under it, I wrote actions and then wrote simple verbs in a neat order. Call bank. Open new account. Transfer share. Photograph documents. Schedule meeting. Make copies. Secure keys. The words were small, but each one pulled me 1 inch farther from helplessness. I put check marks next to call and schedule because the message to Robert was sent, and the bank would open at 9. The clock over the stove ticked past 2. I felt tired, but not the kind of tired that fogs judgment. It was the clean fatigue of a man who had moved his hands with purpose. I put the files back in the cabinet, except for the stack I would carry tomorrow. I taped a small envelope closed around the spare SUV key and wrote a single dot on it so I could find it by touch without thinking. I placed it at the back of the drawer under the dish towels. Not hidden, only quiet. I stood at the window over the sink and looked out at the street. The oaks held their shape against a gray sky, and a lone car rolled past with headlights on low. Somewhere a dog barked twice, then settled. The house was still. I was not empty anymore. The list had given the night a spine. Images came and went. Margaret at the table with her laptop and a map of Rome. Alex in a suit too tight at the shoulders. A train platform in Florence with a name I had tried to pronounce and now did not care to. Those pictures no longer felt like a verdict. They were only facts placed next to other facts on a page. I did not have to win an argument that had never been meant to listen. I had to do the work in front of me. I rinsed the mug and left it to dry on the rack. I gathered the documents into a single brown envelope and slid it into my old briefcase, the one I had not used since my last safety training at the mill. I tried the latches. They still clicked clean. I set the case by the front door so I would not forget it after sunrise. On my way back down the hall, I passed the mirror and stopped without thinking. The man looking back was tired and older than he remembered, but his shoulders were square and his eyes were clear. The feeling that rose in me was unfamiliar and quiet. It was not joy and not pride. Exactly. It was ownership. For the first time in a long time, I was holding the wheel of my own life, even if the road ahead looked narrow. I turned out the kitchen light and let the house settle around me. The clock kept its small ticking. In the bedroom, the covers were still cool where I had left them. I lay down and let my breath slow. Morning would come, and with it the bank doors, the copy machine at the shipping store, the meeting to set. I closed my eyes and felt the pencil marks on those pages as if they were already carved into wood. Dawn found me at the kitchen table with the brown envelope and the spare key in my palm. I slid both into my jacket and stood for a moment in the quiet. The house had not changed, but I had. I sent a message to Mike while the coffee brewed. He ran a small used car lot on Manchaca and an attached garage where he still turned a wrench when the sales floor was slow. We had known each other since our 20s when we swapped parts in a hot garage behind his uncle's place and learned what patience meant. I told him I needed to stop by with a vehicle and paperwork. He replied within minutes and said he had a bay open. Margaret left for work a little after 7. The gray SUV sat in the driveway where the sun would warm the hood by 10. I took the folder from the file cabinet, checked the title one more time, and ran a finger under the names. The word between them was a quiet gift. Or. I breathed out and put the folder inside the envelope. I slipped the spare key into my pocket and stepped into the garage. I clicked the opener and sunlight poured in. The SUV flashed dully in the light. I unlocked it and sat behind the wheel. I pressed the button and felt it slide back. I rested my hands on the wheel and listened to my own breathing. Then I turned the key, eased out of the driveway, and headed south. A delivery truck lumbered ahead for a few blocks, and a jogger in a neon shirt crossed at an unmarked spot, palm held up in apology. I let the rhythm of the lights carry me. He stood under the awning with a rag over his shoulder, the way he always had. He lifted a hand. I lifted mine and pulled into the shade. He asked about Miles' service accidents. I answered each thing he asked. I told him the tires were a year old, the brakes had been done in spring, and the registration was clean. He asked if the title was ready. I handed him the envelope and said the names on it, allowed one signature. He nodded again. He set the papers on a metal desk scarred by years of work and pulled a set of forms from a drawer. Title, reassignment. Odometer disclosure. Bill of sale. His pen scratched in neat lines. He wrote out a number and pushed the paper toward me. 25,000. He said it flat. A fair number for a clean vehicle with our names and history attached to it. I let the number sit in my mind for a heartbeat. Then I picked up the pen. My hand shook a little when I signed. I signed the title where the line told me to sign. I signed the odometer statement and the bill of sale. Mike countersigned with the same steady hand he used for every deal. He said he could cut a check now or wire the funds. I asked for a cashier's check, something I could hold and place where it belonged. He nodded and stepped into the small office off the bay. While he was gone, I opened the SUV and pulled out the small things that had gathered without anyone noticing. A pair of sunglasses Margaret never wore. A map folded down to a sad square, a remnant from a roadside stop years ago. A half-melted lip balm. The garage door opener clipped to the visor. I put the opener in my jacket pocket and left the other items in a bag on the passenger seat. Mike came back with the check. He placed it on the desk and set a paperclip on top. He told me again that the price was fair, that he could have squeezed it for a little more if he ran it through retail, but he knew what this was, and he knew I did not want this stretched out. I thanked him. We shook hands. His grip was firm and warm. He slid the keys off the ring and put them on a hook behind the desk. A young mechanic in a gray shirt with a name patch I did not recognize climbed behind the wheel. He backed it slowly out of the garage and into the light. I followed Mike outside. The sun had climbed and the heat pressed down. The mechanic eased the SUV to the lot entrance and turned toward the street. He stopped to let a car pass, then pulled out. The taillights flashed once as he braked at the end of the block. Then the vehicle turned and the lights disappeared. The weight that had sat there for weeks lifted in a way I could feel in my shoulders. Mike stood with me a moment longer. He asked if I was all right in that practical way that allows any answer. I told him I was. He said to call if I needed anything else. I put the check into my inside pocket, thanked him again, and walked to my car. On the drive home, the city looked slightly sharpened at the edges. At a red light, I touched the flap of my jacket and felt the rectangle of the check. The number did not feel like a trophy. It felt like a tool. Back at the house, I pulled into the driveway and sat for a minute before turning off the engine. I got out and stood there, hands on my hips, and let the sight register. A decision had been made, and the world had accepted it. I went inside and set the check on the kitchen table. I took a photo of it with my phone for my records, then slid it into the brown envelope with the bank statement and the list from last night. I wrote a small note on a yellow sticky pad that said deposit and stuck it to the envelope. I placed the envelope in my briefcase and closed the latches. The clicks sounded clean. I walked into the hallway and looked at the mirror again. I thought of what Susan had said about taking up space on purpose. I straightened my shoulders. It changed nothing, and it changed everything. The house was quiet in the early afternoon. Margaret would not be home for hours. I washed the coffee mug from the morning and set it on the rack. I opened the drawer with the dish towels and slipped the now empty key envelope to the back. I closed the drawer and wiped the counter with slow, even strokes. There was no satisfaction in imagining what she would say when she noticed. That was not the point. The point was that I had acted within my rights and within the law. The point was that I had taken one step back into the center of my own life. The taillights were gone. The weight had shifted. I could feel a narrow lane ahead and a steady wheel in my hands. I carried the briefcase to the bedroom and slid it under the bed, where I kept things I did not want to trip over. Then I sat on the edge of the mattress and let the air move in and out of my lungs until my breathing matched the slow pace of the ceiling fan. The day continued. I stood again, walked to the kitchen, and poured a glass of water. The next task would come in the morning when the bank doors opened. For now, it was enough to stand in my kitchen and know that the first mark on the plan had been carved into the wood. I carried the briefcase in one hand, the brown envelope in the other, and walked to the line that formed in front of the teller windows. I said I wanted to open a new individual account in my name only. Then I needed to withdraw my share from a joint account I held here and take it by check. I said my share. 60,000. I told her a cashier check made out to me was what I needed. We started with the new account. I said yes. I told her I wanted to deposit it into the new account as my opening balance. She said there might be a short hold on a portion of the funds until the issuing bank cleared it. The number matched the figure I had written in pencil the night before. She asked again for the amount, and I said 60,000. I said yes. For the first time in weeks, my hands did not shake. I asked for a balance slip for the joint account, and she printed it. I looked at the number and folded the slip once. She asked if there was anything else today. I said I would like to pick up a small safe deposit box. She walked me to the back where the attendant took my information and had me sign another card. A metal drawer slid open with a sound that was both old and certain. I chose a box that would hold a few envelopes and a thumb drive. The attendant handed me 2 keys on a small ring. The weight of them fit neatly in my palm. I thanked Carla and stepped out into the brightness of late morning. The heat had already begun its slow climb, the kind that bleaches the sky until noon. I sat in the car and held the cashier check again, then slipped it into the brown envelope with the new account documents. For a moment, I let my mind drift to a picture I had been trying not to see. Margaret on a narrow street in Florence, the sunlight cut into bands by old buildings, Alex beside her, in a shirt a little too tight. They raise 2 small glasses of something bright and expensive, and she laughs in a way I remembered from years ago. I felt the old sting of it. Then I pictured another scene. She hands over a card linked to the joint account for some little indulgence on a long day. The terminal pauses. The balance is lean. The clerk looks up and says a few apologetic words. The moment sours at the edges. The picture did not make me cruel. It made me honest. I had taken my share. Nothing more and nothing less. I drove from the bank to the credit union on the other side of town. I wanted distance between her accounts and mine. The lobby there was quieter, and the woman at the desk had the patient voice of someone who helps teachers and nurses and retired men set down their worries in tidy stacks. I handed her the cashier check and my identification, and within minutes the funds were sitting in an account with only my name on it. She asked if I wanted an automatic transfer to savings every month. I said yes, a small one, and she smiled as she typed. She handed me a stamped receipt and a folder with a booklet I knew I would not read. I thanked her and walked back out into the heat. On the way home, I stopped at a shipping store and made copies of the deposit slips and the new account summary. The copier spit out pages that smelled faintly of warm plastic. I slid the copies into the envelope and wrote the date at the top in small block letters. I thought about the pencil marks from the night before and the way they had guided my steps. The second mark was now more than graphite on paper. It was ink and signatures and numbers that matched. My phone buzzed as I reached the car. A message from Robert appeared. He could meet tomorrow at 8:30 at his office on Congress. I replied that I would be there and slid the phone into my pocket. I rested both hands on the roof of the car for a moment and let the sun heat my skin. The world had not changed shape around me. The store signs were the same. The traffic hummed the same notes. But inside my chest, the loose parts had begun to fit again. Back at the house, the quiet did not feel like accusation anymore. I set the envelope on the kitchen table, opened the safe deposit box keys, and put one in my wallet and one in the drawer beside the sink under a stack of warranties. I poured a glass of water and stood at the window over the sink. A pair of grackles hopped along the fence. The patch of concrete where the SUV had been was still bright from the morning sun. A breeze moved the live oak leaves in shivers that looked almost like speech. I took a legal pad from the counter and made a short list of what remained. Notify my credit union of the appointment with the lawyer. Gather the tax statements from the file. Print the last 2 mortgage statements. Make a second set of copies for the safe deposit box. I added a final line that was not a task exactly. Breathe. The afternoon drifted forward. I put the envelope in the hall closet behind a stack of board games the kids had outgrown. I sat at the table and ate a turkey sandwich I barely tasted and checked the bank app on my phone to confirm the numbers I already knew. Everything matched. I locked the screen and set the phone face down. A thought came then that did not ache like the others. I saw Margaret in a restaurant in Rome, a glass raised the light on her face. Alex smiles and signals for the check. She reaches for her card as if on reflex. The waiter returns and speaks softly, with a practiced diplomacy. The corner of her mouth tightens. She catches the look Alex gives her. It is not a kind look. It is the look of a young man who has just learned a detail about a story he thought he knew. I did not dwell on it. I let the image pass like a cloud crossing the street. I rinsed my plate and put it on the rack beside the mug from the morning. I checked the time and thought about traffic on the way to Congress in the morning. I put the briefcase by the door again and slipped my wallet and keys into the dish on the table. The day had given me what I needed. The plan had 2 firm notches cut clean. I stood in the middle of the kitchen and listened to the house settle. The quiet felt earned. The rest would follow in its time. I carried the briefcase and walked toward a narrow building where Robert kept his practice on the 3rd floor. He stood when he saw me, taller than I remembered, hair, more silver now, the same careful eyes. We shook hands, and he steered me to a chair across from his desk. I said I had been better and worse, and that I was here because I was finished being a spectator in my own house. I set the brown envelope on the desk and slid out the stacks I had arranged. Vehicle papers, bank statements, the mortgage insurance, the property tax receipts, and the old file from Harris Lumber about my pension. Or he said, which means one of you can transfer without the other. He asked if the car was already handled. I told him it was. He moved to the bank statements and the joint account summary. He asked what I had done. I told him I had opened an individual account at the credit union, deposited a vehicle check there, and taken $60 from the joint to my name by cashier check before placing records in a safe deposit box. In Travis County, the standing orders will prevent either party from wasting assets once we file, he said. Before filing, either owner can access a joint account, but the court can correct anything that crosses the line from prudent to predatory. You took your share. You documented it. You did not drain to harm. You are within your rights. He moved through the mortgage, noted the balance, and nodded at the tax receipts. Community property, he said, and I could hear the months of cases behind the words. Texas says just and right rather than a clean half, but in a long marriage with facts like yours, close to half is the usual path. This one will need a QDRO, and so will hers, and that is a court order we can craft so the division is clean and tax protected. I told him Daniel thought I was tearing the house apart, and Emily had put a hand on my arm and said she would stand wherever I stood. He nodded again and said the case belonged to the 2 of us, but judges are human, and they notice who shows up with a steady posture. I told him what I had heard from the kitchen, the voice, the plans, the laughter, the way she said, "Do not worry about me." He said adultery was a ground that could tilt a division, not by miles, but enough to matter, and that the court cared more about facts than about poetry. I told him I had seen screens and dates, and I could get screenshots if opportunity allowed. He said we would proceed on no fault to start and leave room to amend if proof hardened. File the original petition for divorce in Travis County today. The standing orders will attach, so neither of you can hide or move big pieces or change beneficiaries. We will ask for temporary orders that keep the basic life steady while the case moves one party in the house. Bills paid, no spending sprees, no overnight guests around grandchildren. I said I did not want her blindsided in a grocery store, but I also did not want to beg for a signature she would wave like a trophy. He said we would serve her at home in a respectful way, and that he would instruct the server to speak plainly and leave. It was simple and clean, with a retainer that made me think of a good used pickup. 5,000 to start hourly charges spelled out. I took out my checkbook and wrote the number with letters to match. He gave me a receipt and placed the check in a drawer with a careful hand. The names looked heavier in that font. Marriage on this date, separation on this later one. No minor children to place with one home or the other. Community estate to be divided in a just and right manner. He left a space to list the house, the accounts, the vehicles. He took notes on my pension and hers. He wrote that waste of community funds would be considered if evidence arose. He asked me for Margaret's work address and our home address, my phone, her phone, and email. I gave him each thing and spelled them out slowly so the page would hold no errors. When he finished the draft, he turned the screen so I could read. The language was spare and exact. There was no paragraph that sought revenge. There was only the shape of a door being opened with a key rather than a boot. He printed the pages and laid them on a blotter that had seen years of signatures. I picked up the pen and thought of the chain of days that had led here. Young man in a rented suit saying vows he meant with all he had. 2 children growing through chapped knees and school concerts. 40 years at a mill that had its own rhythm like a heartbeat. 1,000 dinners where small words carried big loads. A dream of Italy on a coffee table between bills. A Tuesday night where that dream was moved to another man's calendar. I wrote my name in full, each letter clear. It felt like a link snapping in a chain that had been corroding for years. Not a violent break, but the clean pop of metal giving at last. He said they would e-file with the district clerk within the hour, and that the standing orders would take effect as soon as the clerk received it. He asked whether I wanted him to request exclusive use of the house on a temporary basis. I said yes, and he wrote a short motion that said, the house was where I lived, and that stability mattered, and that nothing about this case was improved by upheaval for either of us. He spoke about next steps in a steady cadence, inventory and appraisement, so there were no surprises. Exchange of financials, a meeting in a few weeks to assess the negotiation landscape. He said most Travis County cases resolve without a trial when adults decide to be adults. He said if that failed, he knew how to stand in a courtroom and speak for a man who had carried his weight. He told me to keep breathing and keep records and speak softly when speaking would do. He slid a thin folder across the desk with copies of what I had signed and a checklist on top. I placed the folder in my briefcase and latched it. The click was familiar. I stood, and he stood with me. We shook hands again. He held my grip an extra second in that quiet way that says you are not walking out of here alone. I stepped onto Congress, and the light hit me full in the face. Traffic moved, a bus rumbled past. A cyclist coasted at the light with one foot down. I walked to my car with the briefcase light in my hand. The fear that had sat in my ribs had lost its seat. I set the case on the passenger side and sat for a moment with both hands on the wheel. The day had a new edge to it. On the seat beside me lay a folder with my name and the petition number that would now be part of my life. I turned the key and eased into the flow of late morning, the courthouse behind me and the road opening ahead. I drove the length of South Congress with the petition folder on the seat beside me and the sense that my life had been taken off a shelf and set back into my hands. By the time I reached home, the sun had shifted past noon, and the house looked the same as always, but I did not. I set the briefcase on the table and called Emily first. I told her I needed both kids at her place for dinner the next night. She said yes with no hesitation. Then I texted Daniel and kept it simple. Family dinner. Tomorrow at 7. He replied with a single word. Fine. That evening, a knock came at the door just after 6. The process server stood on the porch with a clipboard and a polite distance. He asked for Margaret by name and handed over the packet when she stepped forward. She did not look at me. She closed the door slowly and carried the envelope down the hall. 15 minutes later, the bedroom door shut with more force than the hinges needed. I heard her make a call in the next room. I went through my list, made copies, put one more key on the safe deposit ring, and checked the time every hour until 6:30. I drove to Emily's place with a pot of chili and a stack of paper plates, because real plates felt like a promise I could not keep. She hugged me at the door and squeezed longer than usual. Daniel arrived on the minute. He walked in stiff-shouldered eyes, flat jaw set. Emily filled 3 bowls and set out cornbread she had baked that afternoon. Daniel set his spoon down first. He looked straight at me. He said he could not believe I had done this. He said I had filed papers like a stranger, and that I was about to destroy our mother's life because I was hurt. He said I had embarrassed her with that car stunt, and that I had taken money from a joint account, like a man who does not know shame. I set my spoon down and folded my hands on the table so I would not clench them. I told him I filed because a marriage ends 2 ways, by honesty or by neglect, and I had chosen the one that left a record. I told him I sold a vehicle with my name on the title and placed the funds where they could be accounted for. I told him I took my share from a joint account and documented every step. I told him I did not drain a thing to be cruel. I took what the law says is mine. I said the rest quietly. I said his mother had planned a trip to Italy with a younger man and told me to stay home because I would embarrass her. Daniel laughed without humor. He said Mom deserved to live a little. He said I had made myself old and small, and that now I was punishing her for finding air. He told me I should be ashamed for dragging our private life into a courthouse. I told him the courthouse is where adults go when there is no truth left in the kitchen. I told him I had asked to be included and had been told to sit quietly in my own house. I told him I had listened for months to being called soft and slow and finished. I told him I had been steady while she practiced her new smile with someone who had not carried this family through lean years. Emily put her spoon down and folded her napkin. She said Mom had called her too. She said Mom had told her I had turned vindictive and that I was trying to ruin a good thing out of spite. She said she loved her mother, but she was tired of being told half-truths. She said Mom had checked out a long time ago and had been mean about it. She said the Italy trip was the final proof and that pretending otherwise felt like lying to herself. He told his sister not to take sides. He said what Mom had done or not done did not give me permission to humiliate her in the street. I looked at my son and saw a man who had built his beliefs on a picture of us that never aged. I told him I had asked both of them to dinner as soon as I could speak without shaking. I told him I had not called the neighbors. I told him gossip travels without a driver. I told him I would have preferred to handle all of this quietly, but silence is a luxury only one person enjoys when a secret is being kept. I said I was sorry he had to learn this way. I did not apologize for the petition. He said I was not the man he grew up admiring. He said the man who taught him to keep his word would never do this. He said I had turned into someone else. He grabbed his keys and walked to the door. The silence after he left felt heavier than the sound of his anger. Emily reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. When she did speak, she said she was with me. She said the words without ceremony. I am with you, Dad. I let the air move in and out. My eyes blurred and cleared. I nodded and said thank you, because anything longer would have broken something I wanted to hold. Emily stood and began to clear the table. I told her I could handle it. She said I could let her help for once. Then she leaned against the sink and looked at me. She said Daniel would come around in his own time. She said he loved his mother, and he loved me, and that he needed the story to be simple for a while to keep breathing. She said we did not have to fix him tonight. I nodded and picked up the crumbed napkins and carried them to the trash. When the counters were clean and the lights turned low, we walked to the door. Emily hugged me again and held on. She told me to text when I got home. I promised I would. She squeezed my shoulder and let go. I stood on her small porch and listened to the steady noise of Austin at night. Under it there was something else. The pressure of Emily's hand still resting across mine. The shape of that support was small, and it was enough. I drove home with the windows cracked and the radio off. The house met me with the same front step and the same door, and a quiet that no longer threatened to swallow me. I poured a glass of water and stood at the window and watched the street turn dark at the edges. I turned off the kitchen light and let the dark hold steady around me. The next part would come soon enough. Margaret flew out on a gray morning that felt like any other workday. I watched the taillights fade and stood in the doorway until the sound of the car was gone. I made coffee and wrote the date on a small card I taped inside the cabinet. 2 weeks. I decided I would put something solid into each day, something with weight I could hold in my hands. After breakfast, I drove to the American Legion Hall off South Lamar. A handful of men and one woman were setting up folding chairs for a noon meeting. I signed the clipboard, shook hands, and carried chairs to the back row. We talked about a ramp one member needed built for his wife, about a pantry drive for the end of the month, about a buddy who needed a ride to a doctor across town. When the meeting ended, a man named Earl pressed a list into my hand and told me Saturday morning was good for fishing if I was interested. I told him I would be there and meant it. Back at home, I pulled the maple table out from the corner of the dining room. I carried the table into the garage and set it on sawhorses, then took a pencil and marked the worst spots. I planed the edge in slow strokes, letting the shavings fall in light curls to the floor. Sanding came next. The next morning, I woke before 5 and met Earl at a gas station. We drove his old boat out to the lake while the sky picked up a thin ribbon of pink. We did not talk much. He cast toward a shadowed bank, and I let my line fall near a cluster of reeds. I brought a keeper to the side, and Earl scooped it with the net and slapped my shoulder once. When I got home, I cleaned the table with a tack cloth and laid down the first coat of finish. By late afternoon, the surface glowed. I left the door cracked to let the air move and sat on the step with a glass of water. On the third day, a message from Emily came with a photo of her cat wedged inside a grocery bag. I texted back that the table was almost done, and she sent a thumbs up and told me to save her a seat for dinner when it was back in the house. I set the safe deposit key in a small dish beside the door where I keep my wallet. The small order of it made me feel steady. Near the end of that first week, Daniel came by unannounced. He asked if I knew what Mom was going through, that she was alone in another country dealing with work and flights and time zones while I played house. He said people at his office had heard that he was tired of explaining. He told me I was selfish for filing when I could have waited until she came home to talk like decent people. I told him I had tried to talk, and there had been no door to knock on. I told him I waited long past my turn, and that hard things do not get easier when you put them on a high shelf. I told him fear had taught me nothing but delay. He said I should have considered what this would do to the family name. I told him a name is built on how we live, not on how carefully we pretend. He asked if I felt any shame for selling the car and taking money. I told him I felt shame for how long I had allowed myself to be diminished. I told him I had sold a vehicle with my signature right beside hers, and I had taken a documented share of a joint account, so no one could pretend later that night had blurred the facts. He asked if I even cared what it looked like. I stepped closer so he could see my eyes and told him that someday he would understand. The words surprised me in how simple they came. I did not say them to win. I said them because there was nothing else that fit. He held my gaze longer than he ever had as a boy. For a heartbeat, I saw him think of a dozen answers and reject each one. He looked away first. He told me he had a meeting and could not stay. I stood in the kitchen until my breathing slowed, then went to the garage to check the table. The finish had set clean. I ran the back of my knuckles over the edge and felt no snag. I set 2 plates and 2 forks and 2 glasses in place even though I was alone, then gathered them back into the cabinet. The next morning I went to the Legion Hall again and signed up to build the ramp for the member on the list. Susan crossed the street that afternoon with a basket of tomatoes from her yard and told me I looked 10 years younger. I told her good work will do that to a face. At night I slept with the bedroom window open so I could hear the world move. Sometimes I would wake in the early hours and think about Margaret on a long day, there a museum or a meeting or a narrow street at dusk, and I would feel the old ache push at my ribs. I would get up, drink water, and stand in the doorway of the garage and breathe until the feeling passed. One afternoon, Emily came by and we ate sandwiches or chinchompos at the newly finished table. We talked about her students and a field trip she was planning for the spring. We did not talk about Italy. The days folded into a kind rhythm. I worked with my hands. I showed up where I said I would. I told the truth without reaching for blame. The house began to sound like itself again. News reached me on a Sunday afternoon while I was sanding the last faint ridges from the maple table. My phone buzzed with a message from Susan that said she needed to borrow a ladder for a gutter clean. When she crossed the lawn, she carried more than a request. She stood in the garage doorway, eyes steady, and told me that a niece of hers who worked in the same building as Margaret's firm had passed along what everyone downtown was already repeating. Alex had come back early and alone. The story went that in Florence, outside a small hotel near the river, he had told Margaret he was not looking for baggage. The word landed like a flat stone. Susan stopped there and watched my face. I nodded once and thanked her for the truth. She asked where the ladder was and I led her to it. When she left, I sat on the step and let the sander cool under my hand. I pictured the narrow streets I had seen in guidebooks. I could not find joy in the thought of Margaret standing there with a suitcase and a new understanding of her place in someone else's story. By Monday, the ripple had reached farther. Earl called to ask if I could swing by the Legion to help unload donated plywood. She had gone straight into a glass-walled conference room with her director and an HR rep. He said there would be a memo disguised as a reminder, and that everyone would read it, knowing exactly who it was for. I thanked him and said I would be there in an hour. After we finished, Earl said he had a spare spot on his boat if I needed the water. He clapped my shoulder and said I looked like a man sleeping again. I told him I was learning. Emily sent a text that evening with a screenshot of something a coworker had posted, and then taken down a group at a restaurant table, wine glasses in a loose circle, the caption about surviving a long Monday. In the corner of the image, Margaret's face was visible in profile. She was not smiling. I wrote back that I would be here. I kept moving through my small list. I took the table inside and set it where it belonged. When Susan stopped by to return the ladder, she stood at the doorway and nodded slowly. On Wednesday, Daniel called and left a voicemail. He said work was killing him and that he wanted to talk later. He did not mention his mother. Thursday afternoon, the HR meeting rumor ripened. A man I knew from church who handled office equipment downtown said he had been in the lobby. He said a few hours later, a bulk email titled Travel Guidelines appeared in inboxes across the firm. That evening, I sat on the porch with a glass of water. A rideshare car that was not Margaret's slid to a stop in front of the house across the street. For a second, my breath paused. I felt something loosen in my stomach and then settle. She arrived Friday just after noon. The front door camera pinged my phone before the rideshare pulled to the curb. I watched her through the front window as the driver set her suitcase on the walk. She looked at it, and her expression moved from confusion to comprehension, and then to something I could not name. She took a breath and squared herself and came up the walk. I opened the door before she could knock. She stepped into the entryway and set the suitcase down with care. She did not smile. She did not pretend. She said she was home. I said, I knew. She asked where the SUV was with a voice that tried for neutral and missed. I told her it had been sold, that the title had allowed the transaction, and that the funds had been placed where they could be accounted for. She looked past me toward the kitchen. I stepped aside and let her see the table. Inside, she moved as if the room had shifted an inch since she left. She put a hand on the back of a chair and left it there, fingers resting lightly on the smooth wood. She asked if any mail had come from the bank. I told her there would be a statement waiting that showed a withdrawal documented by a cashier check, and that half a joint account meant half not theft. She swallowed, and the sound of it was louder than the hum of the refrigerator. For a minute, neither of us spoke. She set the phone on the table and drew a breath that shivered at the end. She asked if I had filed. I told her there was a petition on file at the courthouse with an attached order that kept both of us from moving assets and from inviting chaos into rooms where grandchildren spend weekends. She said we could talk, that there had been misunderstandings, that work had been intense, that Alex had not been what she thought. She said I had humiliated her by serving papers. She said the car was an outrage. She said I had made a spectacle for neighbors and children. She said she would not be made small by a man afraid of being left behind. She sat down and put both hands flat on the table like she needed to feel something solid. Her phone buzzed. It was her director. I imagined the conversation that waited. She said she needed a shower and asked if the guest bath had towels. I told her I had placed some there this morning. She rose and rolled the suitcase down the hall, without asking why the guest room and not ours. I stayed at the table and listened to the water start and steady. I looked at the light moving across the finish I had laid down with patience and thought about the ways a thing can be made new, without pretending it was never scarred. The house had taken on a different sound over the past weeks. When the water stopped and footsteps came back down the hall, I stood and poured 2 glasses of water and set them on the counter. She stepped into the kitchen in a clean shirt, hair damp, face bare. She looked at the glass and then at me. That place was gone. I was right here. She lifted the glass, took a careful sip, and set it back down with both hands around it. She said we could fix this if I would just be patient. There is already a mess, I said. The papers are filed. The orders are in place. We will divide what the law calls ours and move on. You cannot do this, she said. You cannot throw away 40 years because your feelings got hurt. You cannot sell my car and take my money and pretend it is noble. You told me to stay home, I said. You told me I would embarrass you. You took a promise we made in our thin years and put it in another man's calendar. I am not throwing away anything. I am letting go of what you already set down. She said I had made this public. She said the neighbors were whispering and our son was furious. She said I could have kept it quiet. She said I chose spectacle. It is where people go to tell the truth when kitchen tables fail. I did not call a single neighbor. I did not post a single word. I made a record because it is the only way this ends without more damage. The anger thinned and something like fear edged in. She asked again where the SUV had gone. I repeated myself. Sold at a fair price. Proceeds documented. My share from the joint accounted for. Safe. Traceable. She closed her eyes and breathed out slow. Emily's car door sounded in the driveway. I had asked her to stop by with the spare house key for a neighbor, and she came in without knocking like she always had. She stood beside me at the counter and put a hand on my arm. Margaret's head turned. Then the words changed shape. She said I was poisoning our daughter. She said I was twisting her against her own mother. She said it was cruel. You did not need my help with that, Emily said, calm and even. You made your choices. Dad is making his. We will be fine. Margaret moved a half step toward her. You would take his side after everything I did for you, she said. Emily did not flinch. She kept her hand on my arm and said, I am on the side of what is true. Margaret turned back to me. You cannot do this, she said louder now. You cannot end this without my permission. You have spent our whole marriage thinking I needed your permission, I said. Not anymore. She opened her mouth as if to push back and nothing came. Her hands dropped from the glass. For a long second, she stared at the table. She asked where she was supposed to go. I told her the temporary orders allowed either of us to remain in the house, but that I would prefer we not share rooms. I said the guest room was made up for now. She closed her eyes again and nodded. Her phone buzzed on the table. Daniel. She did not pick up. She opened a text thread and typed fast, then erased whatever she had written. She set the phone down and backed a step from the counter. I told her I would be on the porch for a while. I told her she could have the kitchen if she wanted to eat. Emily said she would stay for a minute. Margaret gave a single small nod and walked down the hall to the guest room suitcase rolling quietly on the wood. When the door clicked shut, Emily let go of my arm and exhaled. She asked if I was steady. I told her I was. She said she would drop by after her meeting to bring a casserole a parent had sent for Teacher Appreciation Week. She smiled once, hugged me, and stepped out. I sat on the top step and let the warmth soak into my knees. The street was calm. The live oaks shifted with a small wind. I rested my elbows on my thighs and looked straight out at nothing in particular and everything. After a while, a shadow crossed the grass. Susan stood at the edge of the walk with her hands tucked into the pockets of her garden apron. She did not ask what had happened. She did not need to. She said she had extra peaches and handed me a small brown bag. She said if I wanted company, she could sit quietly and we could both pretend the world made sense. I told her I was good for now. The sun went about its work across the roofs. I thought about the courtroom language Robert had used just and right. I thought about a younger me holding a travel guide with both hands, about Margaret's voice half a world away saying she was not baggage, while a man decided he was not carrying anything for anyone. The front door opened behind me. Margaret stepped out and stood a few feet away. She said she had made a sandwich and placed a plate on the counter for me if I wanted it. She said she had spoken to Daniel and that he was upset. She said Emily had texted that she would be back later. After a moment, she went back inside and the door closed. Twilight took the street by small degrees. A train horn called from somewhere near the river, and the sound carried long. I leaned back against the post and watched the sky pull lavender over the west. The day slowed until the seconds felt like they had edges. I did not need a vow or a toast or a rehearsal. I said it out loud anyway, a whisper that surprised me with its steadiness. Italy was not mine. Freedom is. I sat there until this last copper light left the oak leaves. The air cooled. I stood and stretched and felt the good ache of a man who had used his body for work he believed in. I went inside and turned off the lamp in the dining room and the kitchen light and the hall light, one switch at a time. If you are listening and you have carried a weight that was not yours for longer than you can remember, hear me now. You are not too old to set it down. You are not too late to start again. If this story made sense to you, share it with someone who needs it. Leave a word so others know they are not alone. Subscribe so you do not miss the next chapter of a life rebuilt. Then turn off a light you do not need, step onto your own porch and let the evening tell you what is still possible.